Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I want to look at some things that we're seeing in the news and try to understand their relevance to Bible prophecy. So, what have we been seeing in the news? We've been seeing Russia in Ukraine. And tonight, I want to take a look at these events and the relevance of how these events fit into the framework of Bible prophecy. And you may be wondering what's going on. You may be wondering why these things are happening. Why, in this day and age, would we see a country like Russia invade Ukraine? And why we're hearing about more wars? And my goal here in looking at this is to try to understand why these things are happening. That God has foretold that certain events would happen, but more particularly that these events would lead up to the return of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And that is a hope that we are looking forward to. And so tonight we're going to look at Bible prophecy, but more specifically we're going to dive into Russia's history. We're going to go far back. We're going to look at the USSR a bit, but we're going to go even further back than even the USSR, at the origins of Russia and the history of Russia, and see how that provides relevance to Russia's interest in Ukraine today and how that fits into Bible prophecy. Now, Bible prophecy is something that I find very interesting. But one thing that I want you to know is that when we're looking at history, I am not a history buff. When I was in high school, I hated history. Of all the subjects in school, history was the one I disliked the most. I did my absolute minimum to get through history and move on to the things that I found more interesting. And so I have a very weak foundation in terms of history. Now, since I got out of high school and I got more interested in Bible prophecy, then I've tried to get caught up in my understanding. But my point is, what I want to present to you tonight is something that I hope is something that everyone can understand. Regardless of what your understanding of history is and what your background in history is, I want to present this in a way that hopefully everyone can understand. Many times we've heard talks on Bible prophecy, which are absolutely great talks. And yet, to understand those talks, we need to already understand Bible prophecy. Now, before we actually get to Russia and Ukraine, I want to set a little bit of context on Bible prophecy and why Bible prophecy is relevant to us. I've got a couple of verses here, and I want to rip through these quickly. But the point that I want to make in looking at these verses is that Bible prophecy was given to us by the inspired hand of God. And it was given to us for a particular purpose, and that was to prepare us for the return of his Son. God has given us a record of the things that are to come to pass that would lead up to the return of his Son. Revelation chapter 1 says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John, who bare record of the word of God and of the testimony of Jesus Christ, and of all the things which he saw. Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. These are the words of Christ given to the Apostle John. And it says, blessed is he that reads, and they that hear the words of these prophecies. Why? Because these are the things that we are to look for that are leading up to the return of his Son. Again, in Amos chapter 3, shall a trumpet be blown in the city, and the people not be afraid? Shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it? Surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he reveals his secret unto his servants the prophets. These things have been revealed. These things God has written in his inspired word. Now, do we understand it? Do we understand all the details? Absolutely not. We are seeking to understand. But there are many details that we are still trying to understand and trying to dig into and to tease out what they mean. And many times we get it wrong. By no means am I going to say that I can look at prophecy and I can tell you everything about it and I've got it right. It is an exercise of seeking. But one thing we can be certain is that God has written this in his word. It says, surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he reveals his secret unto his servants, the prophets. Daniel chapter 2 says, but there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter day. These are things that were written about the latter days. There's no generation in time who these things are more relevant to than you and I. Because these are the things that will lead up to the fulfillment of our hope, lead up to the establishment of God's kingdom on this earth. And it says, God, the God in heaven, reveals these secrets. Now, not everyone sees it this way. In the last days, we're told that there would be many who scoff at prophecy. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter tells us, knowing this, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they are willingly ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. Peter is saying that for every person who tries to understand and to watch and to seek, there will be many more who scoff and say, why are we looking? All things continue as they were. In other words, they tried in the past and time continued on. History continued on. So why try again? Christ will come whenever he comes. Why try to understand? But it says, they are willingly ignorant that God has revealed these things unto his servants. Now, prophecy is intentionally ambiguous and vague. But there is a structure that we can be confident in. And we can discuss the minutiae and the details, and we will get many of those wrong. And it's not our attempt to look in a crystal ball, but it is our attempt to take what God has given us and to try to understand his plan and purpose and how the events that we are seeing unfold before our eyes today, and connect the two so we can make sense of what we're seeing. One more verse, and that is in 1 Thessalonians 5. 1 Thessalonians 5 says, but of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. Many people stop right there. And they say, look, we know that when Christ returns, it will be as a thief in the night. So why are you watching? He's going to just suddenly appear and nobody's going to know when, and it's going to be as a thief in the night. See, it says right there, the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. But if you continue in the rest of the verse, when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. So, brethren and sisters, absolutely, Christ should not come as a thief to us. Christ comes as a thief to those who are in darkness, who are willingly ignorant. But we, hopefully, are watching and waiting so that he does not come as a thief in the night. Now, one other disclaimer that I want to say quickly before we get into the history of Russia, and that is trying to understand prophecy does not disannul the need for compassion. What we are seeing in Ukraine today, we are seeing one nation come against another, and we are seeing many people displaced, their livelihoods destroyed, and their lives and their homes uprooted, and in many cases, friends and family lost. And there is absolutely a need for compassion. We have brethren and sisters who are there in Ukraine, who are suffering. And we should absolutely have compassion. We have compassion on the suffering, because these are atrocities of man and his wickedness coming against his fellow man. But we also need to try to understand. In looking at those atrocities, then it raises the question in our mind, what is going on? Why is this happening? And if we look at prophecy, then it will help us to understand. It will help us to give meaning to the things that we're seeing. We're not celebrating those atrocities. But what we are doing is we're looking to see why they're relevant and how God has foretold that certain things must happen that will lead up to the return of his son. And that's my goal tonight, is to try to put meaning into what we're seeing in Russia coming into Ukraine. Now, before we get into Ukraine today and what we're seeing, we need to understand a little bit of history about Russia and where Russia came from. So if we go to just the recent history of Russia, then we have the USSR. Now, USSR, maybe it's something that you're familiar with, you've heard of it, maybe you're even old enough to remember the USSR. The USSR was the form of government, the form of the nation of Russia prior to what we see today. The USSR was in place from 1922, and it finally fell in 1991. You may have also heard of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and the USSR are the same thing. USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. That's a long mouthful, and so most people just simply say the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was a communist country. It was a communist country that was very involved in World War II, and it was a threat to many of the Western nations. And after World War II, as many of the Western nations and the nations in Europe were trying to establish democratically elected governments or forms of government, then the communist government of the Soviet Union did not like that. And so the Soviet Union was a threat. The Soviet Union was a threat to the nations in Europe. And this is an example of the things that the Soviet Union would do and why it was a threat to the nations in Europe. It says, communists aided by Soviet Union were threatening elected governments across Europe. For example, in February 1948, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, with a covert backing from the Soviet Union, overthrew the democratically elected government in that country. And then in reaction to the democratic consolidation of West Germany, the Soviets blockaded Allied-controlled West Berlin in a bid to consolidate their hold on the German capital. The Soviet Union was trying to extend their influence and trying to overthrow the democratically elected governments so they could maintain control and influence across Europe. And Europe didn't like that. And the globe, many nations across the globe didn't like that. And finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union fell. In 1991, the Soviet flag flew over the Kremlin in Moscow for the last time. Representatives from the Soviet republics, now pay attention to this list of countries, because these will become relevant. Representatives from the Soviet republics, Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, I'm going to totally mispronounce all of these, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Hopefully I was close. These countries had already announced that they would no longer be part of the Soviet Union. Instead, they declared that they would establish a commonwealth of independent states. And so if we think back to that map that we just saw, we saw Russia and we saw those nations around, the nations around Russia. One by one, those nations declared independence from Russia until finally, independence from the Soviet Union, until finally all that was left was Russia, and the Soviet Union officially was dissolved. Now, there were two organizations that were formed, specifically in opposition to the Soviet Union. We're not going to go into great detail on these, but I just want to touch on them because you're hearing about them in the news. And I want you to understand why these organizations are a threat to Russia today. So in response to the Soviet Union, these two organizations were formed. The first one was called NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a group of 30 countries, 2 in North America, United States and Canada, and 28 countries in Europe. And NATO was specifically formed in direct opposition to the USSR. If you look on the NATO website and their history, they say that explicitly, that NATO was formed in direct opposition to the USSR. Basically, the USSR is powerful, they have a strong army, it's a conglomerate of these nations, and so we need to all form our nations together and build a union where we will defend each other, and we'll merge our armies together, and we can stand together against the USSR. And that was the foundation of NATO. I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to go too far into these, but just to set some context. The second one was the EU, or the European Union. The European Union was formed immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was formed in 1993, and it was basically a similar idea to NATO, that these nations wanted to get together, that they wanted to operate as a single unit, and they wanted to do this, in this case, to make sure something didn't happen like the Soviet Union again. It was like, that wasn't fun dealing with the Soviet Union, with communism in this large organization, and so we are going to join all our countries together to form one unit so we can stand up against any organization that looks like the Soviet Union again. So the EU and NATO, two organizations specifically formed on the basis of standing up against the Soviet Union threat. Now if we look at a map today, here's what we see. We see Russia, the big red nation there, and we see this group of nations, which is the European Union. And they are in opposition to each other. They were formed in opposition, or the European Union was formed in opposition to Russia. Now, over time, Russia and Europe have built relationships, rebuilt their relations. They've built dependencies, they worked together, and they worked through, or it seems that they have worked through a lot of their past history, and they're working closer and closer as allies. But Russia doesn't forget its history. Russia doesn't forget that NATO and the European Union were formed as in response, in opposition to Russia. And so what have we seen in the recent history, in the last 15 or so years? Now, again, looking at this map, think back to what we saw with the USSR and all those nations that were formerly part of the USSR that Russia lost. What have we seen in the last 15 years? We saw Russia go into Belarus. Now in Belarus, it wasn't an aggressive invasion, but they built a treaty. So in 1995, Russia and Belarus established what they called the Treaty of Friendship, the Good Neighbor Treaty, and then in 1999 they established the Equal Rights of Citizens, which was, a treaty to basically say that our two countries would operate as one. We'll share healthcare. We will share education. We will share our militaries. We will share as many things as we can, and specifically in the Treaty of Equal Rights of Citizens, it says that these two countries would operate as a union of equal states. And so what we saw there was the first step of Russia trying to reabsorb what was previously a Soviet Union nation. That was in 1995 and 99. And then what do we see next? In 2008, we see a bit more aggression. We saw down there at the bottom of Russia, we see Russia invade Georgia. And now in 2014, they're at the bottom of Ukraine, Russia annexed Crimea. And so what we're seeing little by little is Russia becoming more and more aggressive, and one by one trying to annex and reabsorb the nations that were formerly part of the USSR, until finally, today, we see Russia in Ukraine. Now, what I want to look at specifically with Russia and Ukraine is the question of, is this just another war? Is this just Russia continuing to be aggressive and increasing its aggressiveness? Is this just simply, we are told that in the last days that there would be wars and rumors of wars, and there's going to be one in Belarus and Georgia and Ukraine and Iran and Iraq, and this is just another war? Or is there something in particular and something special in relation to Bible prophecy that Russia would be interested in Ukraine? So, that brings us to the current events of what we see today. Now, if we go back 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we saw, or 3 weeks ago, we saw Russia building up its troops along the Ukrainian border. Now, Russia's saying, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just a drill. This is just absolutely normal stuff. It's absolutely normal we have 130,000 troops built up along this border. Don't worry, we're not going to invade Ukraine. And then it became very apparent that yes, Russia is going to invade Ukraine, but we don't know when. And so we started seeing headlines like this: the world holds its breath, countdown to war, frantic 48 hours to save Europe from war, until finally, on February 25th, I believe it was, we have war in Europe. Russia invades Ukraine. And honestly, for many of us, this is one of the most... many of us haven't seen something like this in our lifetime, where we see such two nations going against each other like we're seeing in Russia and in Europe, in the global stage, the global response that we're seeing. Another headline: countdown to World War III. Explosions near Kiev. Biden warns of catastrophic loss of life. And so the war started between Russia and Europe. Now, I'm not going to go through a timeline of all the events of what happened in Ukraine to date. They're changing day by day. I would encourage you to read the news and to look at a timeline if you haven't been following it already. Look at a timeline of what has happened over the last 2 weeks. But what was the global response? The global response when Russia invaded Ukraine was nearly unanimous. There were some countries that abstained, and there have been even fewer nations that have actually come out in support of Russia. But for the most part, the global response has been the same, and that is anger towards Russia. And so there has been a flood of sanctions put on Russia. We see Germany turns tough towards Russia in the Ukraine invasion. Ukraine crisis, the escalation of Ukraine crisis fuels fear of confrontation between Russia and the West. Italy, a surprising one. Italy joins the other nations in putting sanctions against Russia. EU, US, UK, and so on and so forth. Poland, Lithuania, Germany, so many nations. And even today, they're announcing new sanctions, and the sanctions continue and continue and continue. And as a result, Russia's economy has been crippled and continues to crumble. So what is Russia's response? Putin escalates even further. So we see the free world versus Putin. And about a week ago now, world outrage as Putin makes a nuclear threat. The first time since the Cold War that we have had nuclear threats at this level. Putin raises the stakes with a nuclear alert. He put his military on nuclear readiness. And finally, Kiev surrounded. Now that in particular is relevant. That Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is surrounded. So how does this relate to Bible prophecy? Why is it important that we understand why Russia has come down, and specifically what I want to look at is why Russia is interested in Ukraine? Now, I want to look at a quote from a book called Elpis Israel, which you may be familiar with. It's written by a man named John Thomas, and it was written in 1848, roughly 170-something years ago. And he says in Elpis Israel, the future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scripture of truth. The Russian autocracy, in its plenitude and on the verge of dissolution, is the image of Nebuchadnezzar, standing upon the mountains of Israel, ready to be smitten by the stone. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. The long-expected, but stealthy, advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact, and salvation will be to those who not only look for it, but who have trimmed their lamps by believing the gospel of the kingdom unto the obedience of faith and the perfection thereof in fruits meet for repentance. And what he says is when Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at presently constituted, is at hand. And so what he's saying is that we need to pay attention to Russia. We need to pay attention to what Russia is doing, because we know that leading up to the return of Christ, Russia will rebuild an empire of nations that will, in its last step, go against the nation of Israel. Now that raises the question of what we're seeing today with Russia coming into Ukraine. Is that its grand move? Is this the standing up of the image empire? Or is there more for us to see? And more specifically, is the next thing that we're looking for Christ's return? What I can say confidently is that while what we are seeing today is absolutely relevant to prophecy, and we will look at in just a moment how this is actually spoken of in prophecy, what I can say confidently is that there is still more that must happen to lead up to the return of Christ. Now, don't take that to mean that we have a lot more time. Many things can happen very quickly. With the divine hand working in the nations, things can progress very, very quickly. But what we can say confidently is that there are still things in prophecy that must be fulfilled, that we are told to look for leading up to the return of Christ. And so, yes, there is more for us to watch for beyond just Russia and Ukraine that will lead up to the return of Christ. But again, those things can happen very quickly. And so don't deceive ourselves in regard to the amount of time that it may take. In another place, and John Thomas wrote, and this is in his book called The Exposition of Daniel, he says, and this is in relation to the area or the dominion or the countries that Russia will have influence over, that Russia will be leading at the time that Christ returns. He says, by turning to a map of Europe and Asia, the reader may trace out the territory of the kingdom of Babylon as it is destined to exist in its last form under the king of the north in his Gogian manifestation. The names of the countries furnished by Ezekiel will lead to a just conception of its general extent. Besides all the Russias, it will take in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Prussia, Austria, Turkey, Persia, Tartary, Greece, Roman Africa, and Egypt. This will be a dominion of great magnitude, extending from the North Sea to the Wall of China and to Afghanistan, and from the Ice Sea to the deserts of Africa and Arabia. Now, we're not going to get into it tonight about how he came to the conclusion of this list of nations. But what I can say is that if we wanted to look into this, into a separate study, that there is ample evidence to support this list of countries. But what we'll say tonight is, the main point is, there is a vast number of countries that are coming with Russia, that are aligned with Russia, either in alliance, voluntarily, or by military force. It's different from country to country. Some Russia will take by force, some it will be through a peaceful alliance. But the main point is, under the influence of Russia, the king of the north, also known as Gog, there will be a great list of nations that come with him. Now, I've seen this quote a number of times. And I've always read it and just simply thought, yeah, there's a big list of nations. There's going to be many nations with Russia. But I never actually stopped to look at a map of all the countries listed to try to understand how much of Europe is going to be with Russia in the last day at the return of Christ. But in preparation for this class, I did that. So here we see a map of Europe. We see there Russia in red with Belgium and Georgia already under the influence of Russia. In all the other nations, in orange and in yellow with Ukraine, is the list of nations listed there in Exposition of Daniel, which was taken from Ezekiel. All of Russia is going to be under the influence all of Europe is going to be under the influence of Russia. Again, some by force, by military aggression, and some by peaceful alliance. But in the last day, when Christ comes and fights against the king of the north, against Russia, there will be a great army with him. And it will be all of these countries of Europe. Which brings us to the question of why is Russia interested in Ukraine? Or how is Russia's interest in Ukraine relevant to Bible prophecy? And why is this exciting today? Why is it interesting, Ukraine in particular? Why is it interesting to see Russia going into Ukraine? Why Ukraine? If we look in Ezekiel 38, now the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, Gog, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around and put hooks into your jaws and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed. Now, many translations actually say all in various forms of armor. All in various forms of armor. In other words, the army that is coming with Gog is made up of many different armies. They're all coming in different forms of armor. They're all coming with different signets and identities, and yet they're all coming together with Russia, the king of the north. So again, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmets. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many people are with you. Prepare yourself and be ready, you and all your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard unto them. And so what we see here from Ezekiel 38 is that when the king of the north comes, when Russia comes, he will come with a conglomeration of many nations and many armies with him. And that's all the nations we saw in that previous slide, that all of Europe and those orange nations. Now I'm going to stop right there on that topic, because that's actually not what we're going to be looking at. We're not going to be looking at the rest of Europe. But the point being is, this is a picture. This is a snapshot of what the global stage will look like at the return of Christ. If we were to continue on in Ezekiel 38, we would see that when this army comes down, then they are met by Christ. And they meet their final destruction. So this is not a picture of today. This is a picture, a snapshot of the global stage at the return of Christ. But what we are looking for today is for the pieces to start aligning, to start building this picture that we see here. And so with that, I'm going to look at these two phrases in particular. The two phrases I have here in green. Gog of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And he says it twice. That this particular organization, this identity, is who the leader will be of this vast army. Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And so this is a title or a description or an identity of a particular party. And this identity is who will be leading this great army to come against the mountains of Israel, who will be met by Christ. And when we see this army come down against Israel and met by Christ, it will be the battle that we know as Armageddon, when all nations are gathered together to fight in Jerusalem. And so the question is, who is this identity? Or how can we understand this identity of this leader? Gog, of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. What does that mean? Well, we're going to breeze through Meshech and Tubal and simply say, again, separately, we could go into this in more depth, but Meshech aligns with Moscow. If you look at the translation of the word and the history of Moscow, then we can confidently say that Meshech refers to the territory of Moscow, and conveniently the names align. The name that we have in Meshech is very similar to the name of Moscow today. Again, there's a lot more evidence in support of that. We're not going to go into that right now. The second one is Tubal. The area of Tubal, there is the Tubalsky River. And Tubal, there was a geographic area known as Tubal. And that geographic area is where the river Tubalsk got its name. And in the Tubal, or by the Tubalsk River, is a town called Tubalski, or Tubalsk. And Tubalsk is, it says there, this is taken from Wikipedia, is a town in Oblast, Russia, located at the confluence of the Tobol River and the Irtysh rivers. Sorry if I mispronounce this. Founded in 1590, the Tobolsk is the second oldest Russian settlement east of the Ural Mountains in Asian Russia, and is the historic capital of the Siberia region. So if we look at a map here, a map of Russia and Siberia. Russia there in red, Siberia in purple. Now all of that is known as Russia. We have Moscow, or Meshek, and Tobolsk, Siberia. And so Moscow and Tobolsk, we can simply align to the area of Russia and Siberia, or specifically Moscow and the Tobolsk area. So we have that part. We have an identity of a country, of an individual who rules, who satisfies the Meshek and Tobolsk, Meshek and Tubal part of that identity. So then the question is, if we have Meshek and Tubal, who is of the land of Magog, Prince of Rosh? That is what we want to look at. And to look at this, we need to go further back in Russian history than simply the USSR. Now, these are taken from some screenshots from a YouTube video, an excellent YouTube video on the history of Russia. If you search YouTube for the history of Russia, this is one of the first results, and it's basically what we want to look at here is the origins of the area of Russia and Ukraine. So, going back very far beyond Soviet Union to 857 AD. We have down here at the bottom of the slide, we have the area in green, which is the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire is in the area that we now know, modern day Turkey. You may have heard of the Byzantine Empire. You may have heard of Constantinople. Constantinople is the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So we will refer to the two sort of synonymously, probably mostly referring to Constantinople. But Constantinople is a city in the Byzantine Empire, down there at the bottom of the map in green. Now specifically pay attention to its relation to the Black Sea. Constantinople is south of the Black Sea. They're right at the bottom. Now, in 857 AD, the Vikings were up in the north, in the area of Finland and Sweden, and they discovered that there were some trade routes. There were some rivers that went down to Constantinople. Constantinople was one of the largest cities in the day. And the Vikings identified that there were these rivers that provided very convenient trade routes that they could get to Constantinople. And so they picked up their boats, they carried their ships across the land and dropped them in the rivers and sailed down the river all the way to the Black Sea until they got to Constantinople. And along the way, they gathered various supplies and furs and spices and whatever else, and they would bring them to Constantinople and they would trade them in the markets. And so with this, they started building relationships with Constantinople. Now, these trade routes were so successful that one of the chieftains of the Vikings ended up establishing trading posts and claiming these trading posts for himself. Now, this individual was named Rurik. And I'm going to highlight certain individuals in this history in relevance to the relevance of Ukraine today. So this individual, Chieftain Rurik, said, hey, these trade routes are highly successful. Why don't we establish some trading posts and I will rule over them? And so around 862, he formed the first one and named it Novgorod. And Chieftain Rurik was the first, and he was the ruler of this area. Now he had two brothers, and he delegated to the two brothers to establish two more trading posts along these routes. And with these three trading posts, he developed them into towns or cities, and he claimed the territory for himself. So Chieftain Rurik established this territory with these three trading posts, and he called it the Rurik dynasty, or it became known as the Rurik dynasty. Now the area that was ruled by Chieftain Rurik with these three cities or trading posts was Novgorod, Smolensk, I totally am going to mispronounce that one, and Kiev. And this area that he ruled became known as Kievan Rus. Now, it became known later in history as Kievan Rus, but he primarily referred to it as the area of Rus. Now, after Chieftain Rurik passed on, then he was followed by his son Oleg, and Oleg moved the capital from Novgorod down to Kiev, and Kiev became the official capital of Rus, or Kievan Rus. And with that, it became known as Kievan Rus. Now, fast forwarding a couple generations, in 980 AD, we have a new individual who's ruling. Now, at this point, there were actually, again, three brothers ruling the three cities. And when these three brothers took over ruling the three cities, there was civil war. And one of the brothers conquered the other two. And when he conquered the other two, he became the primary ruler of Kievan Rus. And this individual's name was Vladimir the Great, or Vladimir the First. And he reestablished, and with his various efforts, he began to establish Kievan Rus as a power to be paid attention to in this area. Now, again, we've lost the context of the Black Sea, but this is just north of the Black Sea. Kievan Rus is located just north of the Black Sea. Now, Vladimir the Great, or Vladimir the First, became known as the Grand Prince of Kiev. Now, the question is, why did he become known as the Grand Prince of Kiev? Well, in 988 BC, this area was going through a tumultuous time. There were uprisings and battles happening and conflicts happening. And in particular, there was one in Constantinople. Constantinople was facing uprisings. And so the emperor, or the Caesar, that was ruling in Constantinople, because remember, there's trading routes that are happening. The whole purpose of Kievan Rus was the trading post or the trading routes to Constantinople. So because the relationship, the Caesar, or the emperor in Constantinople, reached out to his friend, Vladimir the First, or Vladimir the Great, and said, hey, I need help. Can you send me some armies, some of your military support, to help me squash this uprising here in Constantinople? And so Vladimir the Great said, yes, I will send you 6,000 of my army, but I want your sister to marry, to solidify our alliance. I want your sister in marriage. And so the emperor, the Caesar of Constantinople, said, okay, I'll give you my sister, but you are pagan. Constantinople is Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Catholic. If you want my sister and my sister's hand in marriage, then you need to convert to Orthodox Christianity. And not only that, you need to make Orthodox Christianity the primary religion of Kievan Rus. And so Vladimir the Great did. Vladimir the Great was baptized into Orthodox Christianity, and he said he converted Kievan Rus to Orthodox Catholicism. And so because of that, that is what he is known for. That is the greatest accomplishment that Vladimir the First is known for. And with that, it is said that Vladimir the Great baptized Kievan Rus. Because not only did he baptize himself, or was he baptized the whole nation of Kievan Rus in converting them to Orthodox Christianity. Now, one interesting little nugget is that Vladimir the First, when he was baptized on the peninsula of Crimea. And so with that, Kievan Rus was aligned with Constantinople, with a strong bond of alliance. Now, where was Kievan Rus? If we look on a map, this is the area of Kievan Rus. Now, there's a lot of debate on, for example, Russia and Ukraine both claim Kievan Rus as their ancestry. And we're not going to get into those differences. But the point being is Kievan Rus was the birthplace of this area that Russia and Ukraine were in, or are in today. And one of the primary people who established Kievan Rus was Vladimir the Great, or Vladimir the First. Now, this is taken from Putin's own writing. In 2021, in July of 2021, Putin published an article called "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." And so, if you want to know what is going on in Putin's mind, then this is written by him on the unity of Russia and Ukraine. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus. Putin is not going back to the USSR. Putin is going all the way back in history to the foundation of where Russia came from. He's going to the foundation of the dynasty of Rurik, the Rurik dynasty, and the establishment of Kievan Rus. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians were all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory from Ladoga, Novgorod, and Pskov to Kiev and Chernigov were bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian. Economic ties and the rules of the prince of the Rurik dynasty. And after the baptism of Rus by Vladimir the Great, they were bound together by the Orthodox faith. The spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir the First, who was both Prince of Novgorod and the Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely dominates our affinity today. The throne of Kiev held a dominant position in ancient Rus. This had been the custom since the late 9th century, and the tale of bygone years captures for posterity the words of Oleg, the son of Rurik, the words of Oleg the prophet about Kiev. And Oleg said, "Let Kiev be the mother of all Russian cities." So the question is, why is Putin interested in Kiev? Because he is trying to take Russia back to its origin. Back to his mind is with ancient Rus, Kievan Rus. And he calls this individual the Grand Prince of Kiev. Now, Vladimir Putin idolizes this individual, Vladimir the First, quite literally. So much so that he built a statue of Vladimir the First. Now, the statue in Moscow is 57 feet tall. Originally, it was slated to be 82 feet tall, but he couldn't because of various architectural challenges. But the point being is Vladimir Putin absolutely values and idolizes Vladimir the Great, the Grand Prince of Kiev, or ancient Rus. And so the question is, when we come back to Ezekiel 8, who then is the Prince of Rosh? Rosh is a modern English transliteration. The Prince of Rus. I think if we look at the ancient history of Russia, we have the answer for us. That the identity of this individual, Gog, of the land of Magog, Prince of Rus, and Meshech and Tubal. We already have Meshech and Tubal in place, but this individual must also be the Grand Prince of Kiev, or Kievan Rus. And so we see Putin establishing that identity. We've got 4 pieces: Land of Magog, Prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Meshech and Tubal have already been, we've already had those aligned, and today we're seeing Putin trying to establish the identity of the Grand Prince of Rus. So let's pause that for a moment and look at the Land of Magog, and we'll do this very quickly. Land of Magog, Josephus, a historian, Josephus, refers to Magog, son of Japheth, as the progenitor of the Scythians, or people north of the Black Sea. So, and if you look at historians, various historians all agree on this, that Magog, the son of Japheth, the area that Magog had, that he settled in and established territory in, was from the river, the Don River, the River Don, to the Danube River. And if you highlight that and put it over a modern map today, the land of ancient Magog, son of Japheth, is this area here. From the River Don on the right side of the slide there to the River Danube on the left side. And it encompassed this area of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Finland, Germany, and so on. And so, with the Land of Magog, we have this territory of land. And so, the identity of this individual, Gog, of the Land of Magog, which we're seeing Russia starting to encroach upon, of the throne, Prince of Kievan Rus, Meshech, and Tubal. Piece by piece, we're seeing this identity of this individual come together. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about as we draw this to a close. The relationship to Constantinople. The relationship between Russia and Constantinople. Now, this is modern day Turkey, and in modern day Turkey, up there in the upper left of Turkey, we see Istanbul. Istanbul is a modern city. This was ancient Constantinople. Constantinople is Istanbul. In 1453, Constantinople was invaded by the Turks. The Turks, modern day Turkey. And in 1453, Constantinople fell. And with the fall of Constantinople, the rulers in Constantinople fled. Now, the rulers in that day were known as the Caesars. They fled Constantinople and they relocated and established what is now known as Moscow. And they established a new seat of rulership, which is Moscow. Now, they changed their names from Caesars to Tsars, which is the same word. It's just a different form of the same word. And so when they were pushed out of Constantinople and they reestablished their power in Moscow, they never forgot their identity. They never forgot that Constantinople was their home and that they were forced to leave. Now, interestingly, Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Rome was the capital of Western Orthodox, the Western Catholic Church, and Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so Constantinople became known as the Second Rome. Now, when Constantinople fell in 1453, and they fled to Moscow, then Moscow became known as the Third Rome. Now again, they never forgot their identity, that they had to leave their home of Constantinople. So what do we see today? We see headlines like this with Putin: the rising Tsar. Vladimir Putin, the Tsar of the new Russia. And a Tsar is born. And so, again, from yet another angle, we see Putin taking Russia back to its ancient history, that he wants to reestablish the rulership of the Tsar. But in this case, it's not simply the seat of Kievan Rus that he wants. It's the identity with Constantinople. Now, what's interesting is if you look on the religious side, in Moscow, In the Eastern Orthodox Church, if you look at the churches, you look at their steeples, they have crosses like many other churches. Now the cross is the number one, the primary symbol of Christianity. And it's on the steeple in the Orthodox Church in Moscow. But if you look a little bit closer, it's not simply a cross. It's a cross that has stars on it and a crescent moon at the base. And so these stars and the crescent moon, they place alongside their identity with the cross. Now, where do the stars and the crescent come from? The star and the crescent is an iconographic symbol used in various historical contexts, including as a prominent symbol of the Ottoman or Byzantine Empire. It was developed in the Greek colony of Byzantium in 300 BC. And so the Russian identity of Moscow, of the Tsars, is rooted in Constantinople. And so if we go back to the time of the Tsars and we look at the territory that ancient Russia ruled in the time of the Tsars, yet again, we have it reemphasized. Now this map is a little bit disorienting because it's oriented a bit sideways from where we're used to looking. But there on the left, we see the Black Sea. And so use that as a point of reference, that the Black Sea, everything north of the Black Sea was under the territory of the ancient Russia under the Tsars. This is what Putin is trying to reestablish, but more significantly, this is the territory of Gog, prince of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And so in conclusion, coming back to Ezekiel 38, hopefully we've answered the question of why Ukraine. What we are seeing is we're seeing the identity of this individual, piece by piece, coming together. And this individual, again, is the individual who will lead that conglomerate of nations of Europe against the land of Israel. And so there is still more for us to see, more for us to watch for. But absolutely what we're seeing today in Ukraine is relevant to what we see in Ezekiel 38 and the prophecies relating to the latter day.